that we collectively own, be it in some situations it may be the sidewalks, and in some the HOA that I live in, actually, we don't own the sidewalks and we don't own the streets. That belongs to the city. But the baseball field, the walking trails, the clubhouse are what we're all responsible for, and again, some of the entrance ways and things like that. But that is collectively what we're responsible for. That's what your dues go to, things like that. And then in the final one, the covenants that run with land. This is the most, I would say, kind of basic form. So the first neighborhood I ever moved into, we had an entrance way, and everybody paid dues. But it wasn't really. We all had there were covenants on the land that you had to do certain things a certain way. But if you didn't pay your dues, there was no real lien on your property. So it was kind of out of the, everybody in cooperative agreement did this. And so that's kind of where that one comes from. But let me get back to the first two, because again, this is something where there is an agreement that we all need to work together to be certain that what we have in common is taken care of. Now, that's in its simplest form. The next step of that is going to be rules that we all agree to. And this is where the covenants, and so this actually applies to all three of them, but the enforcement mechanism is what's different between the POA and the Condominium Act. So if you live in an HOA, you probably know that sometimes you get nice little letters reminding you to paint your mailbox, or to fix the sod in your yard, or to whatever it may be. But this is where the rules come. This is what most people with an HOA and sometimes complain about, but sometimes appreciate. So the goal with this is everybody agrees to certain rules. So when you buy into this property, you have an opportunity to see what the covenants are, to see what you're agreeing to. In my neighborhood, for instance, I cannot have livestock. I must have a certain, my mailbox must look a certain way, and I have to have a certain selection of grass. There's a few types of grasses we can have in our front yards. Fairly easy to comply with, not horrible, but still rules that you have to follow. So periodically, and I'll tell you, a lot of times it hits during session, is when I'm down at the Capitol lot and not really paying attention to things, I may get a nice little letter saying, hey, your mailbox looks a little faded. So I have to go out and paint it. There's some neighborhood kids that will go around and, paint it for you if you want, and, pay them some money. Sometimes they'll do that. It'll also be where it's, if the grass isn't, cut to the right look, you might get a letter, things like that. But in essence, it is something where they have the ability to tell you you're following the rules or not. Now, in the first two, the Condominium Act and the Property Owners Association Act, let's say you don't comply. So let's say they say, hey, Jeff, you need to cut your grass. It's getting a little long. If I ignore that letter and let it go for 3 more months, and it looks like I'm about to cut some hay out there or something, by that point in time, I'm probably going to have a fine that's levied on me. And they have that ability, because part of moving into that association means I give them some leverage over my property. And so in both of these, condominium and the POA Act, it's under sections 109 for the condominiums and 272 for the POA. They have the ability to levy penalties against me. They also have the ability to charge membership dues. And if I don't pay it, they have the ability to lien my property. So they could put a lien on my property. If I don't pay it in a certain amount of time, they can charge me a late fee. Now, in both of those, the late fees are capped at 10%. It can accrue interest over the years. And if they are forced to say, Jeff, you did not pay your fine for not cutting your grass. So let's say it was $25. They now are charging me $27.50. And then they have to go through and enforce it on me. I may end up owing a lot more because they might have gotten an attorney to go collect on me. But anyways, that's kind of the basics of it. The The other part of that, though, is that, these are contracts essentially that I have entered into, because when I buy the house, I agree to abide by these covenants. And so, from the realtor perspective, while we will stand up for a citizen's right to private property rights, we will also stop at the HOA level and say, but if everybody agrees, when you buy into this property, that you should have, purple gutters, well, then everybody's going to have purple gutters. And if they're not purple, well, shame on you, because you didn't follow the rules that you agreed to when you bought in. Might sound a little silly, but again, it is something that, those are the rules that everybody agrees to. I kind of think of something like Helen, Georgia. Let's say you bought into an HOA and everybody said our houses should look like a Bavarian village. Well, you may think it's kind of silly, but if that's why you bought into it, that's why you bought into it. Now, there are certain things, obviously, that an HOA cannot do, certain things that covenants that run with the land cannot do. You cannot violate fair housing rules. And so while, at points in time, you may have had certain rules that go with that, those are illegal and you can't do them. Country of origin, race, religion, anything like that cannot be something that's part of restrictive covenants. But things like the color of your gutters, the fact that you keep your mailbox painted and fresh looking, things like that, those are the type things they're created for. There's also parts of HOAs, or in some HOAs, they might say that you can or cannot rent your house out. You can or cannot have solar panels on your roof. You can or cannot. And these are things that periodically get tested and adjusted in the legislature. So a couple years ago, as more and more HOAs were starting to more greatly restrict rentals, one of the bills that we fought for and worked on was one that said, if you are a housing provider and you are leasing your house out to someone already, you're grandfathered in. And so what it meant was that an HOA couldn't change their mind on you and say, hey, you've got to evict your tenants, or you got to kick them out when the lease is up, or anything like that. Because if you're doing that already, and it was allowed when you moved in, then it should continue that way. There are discussions about things that you should be able to do. One of the discussions we've seen in the recent years has been talking about saying you cannot be restricted from having certain types of solar panels on your roof. Now, again, in many HOAs, they might have been created 20 years ago, and solar panels might have looked horrible then. But if the law were to change in that direction, the discussion typically has been where it can't be seen, where it's, where it blends in. So as technology changes, as the times change, sometimes there are reasons to go back and revisit the restrictions that might exist. The way things can change in an HOA are if the membership of the HOA agrees with I believe it's typically going to be, and it's going to be in their bylaws, but typically it's going to be a supermajority. So, greater than just half, it's going to be about 2/3 to 3/4. It will be addressed in the bylaws. But if they decide we are going to change, we're tired of purple gutters, we want to have yellow gutters now. This times have changed and that's an old look. So they want to change something. Then they have to get the majority of folks, to whatever their bylaws say, agreeing to that. Same would hold true if they are dealing with restricting rentals or anything else. They have to have significant changes are going to be addressed through the vote of the members. Typically with both of these, you're going to have an established board. The board is going to be what exercises the powers of the HOA, but they are not empowered unto themselves to change the rules of the HOA. So let me kind of, I don't want to just start rambling on and talking about stuff that you may not care to hear about, and I'm happy to answer the questions. So let me see. It looks like some have come in. Sure. What if the HOA, let's see, let me make certain I'm catching all these. Let's see.
I can help you out if you like.
Sure. Let's see. So this one of them says an LLC for the association or an actual certification. If you're forming an HOA, I would say your best course is to go in and get an attorney so that you're making certain you're getting everything right. They do need to be legal entities that are established with the Secretary of State's office. If you're hiring someone to manage the HOA, if it is an outside entity, they do need to be licensed with the Georgia Real Estate Commission. However, if there are some exemptions, if the HOA simply hires an employee, let's say my neighborhood is not hiring an outside firm to manage it, but the board decides they're just going to pay someone full-time as an employee, they are exempt from licensure because now they are under the watch of the whole board. If they are a resident of the HOA, a full-time resident, and that is the only one they're managing, then they can be. And this addresses a smaller HOA typically. I think of this as you have a small neighborhood, not enough to really pull your money together and go out and pay someone a lot of money to do this. I kind of think of this as almost kind of like a little league team, and you have I have a lot of kids, and a lot of times with baseball and soccer and whatever else, I'll be the coach. They don't pay me, but we're having a group of kids. So if I had a neighborhood that had, let's say, 100 homes in it, it may not be worth our while if all we're doing is maintaining the first neighborhood I lived in. All we did was maintain the front entrance sign. We would all get together and throw pine straw out, and our account was enough to buy some paint to freshen it up now and then and change the light bulb on it. We weren't going to go out and hire someone to do that. But if someone in the neighborhood wanted to do that, and we agreed that it was worth paying them, $500 a year to do it, just to be a thank you type thing, that's where that exemption is kind of rooted in. But for the most part, there are a lot of companies out there, there are professional associations that do this. Many of them are realtors that do this, along with being in the Community Association Institute of America is one of the entities that is the membership organization. But they're knowledgeable, they're professionals, this is what they do, but they need to be licensed. And that means that their books are checked, the rules that they follow are governed by the state and regulated by the state. That keeps you safe. So as far as yes, it would need to be a legal entity that's formed. That way they have, their accounts in order, everything that goes with it. And then the people that are actually doing the day-to-day operation, if they're not exempted, they would need to be licensed by the Georgia Real Estate Commission. So let's see, what if the HOA is established after you already have been living in the neighborhood? How would you enforce the fines? This gets to, you cannot be swooped into, I guess would be the legal term. No. You cannot be brought into an HOA without your consent to be part of it. And so if I were in a neighborhood that was not an HOA, so I grew up in a neighborhood, my parents bought the house years before I was born in the 60s, and it was not an HOA. It was your classic 60s neighborhood in Metro Atlanta where you had a 3-bedroom brick house and some trees outside and a creek to play in. If that neighborhood decided it wanted to be governed by an HOA, it would need to establish covenants for the properties that are within it. That means that all of the owners would have to agree. So now I can have covenants on my property without having to be part of an HOA. I could say, if I own land, and let's just say I go out in the middle of rural Georgia and buy an acre of land, I could say, this acre of land, I'm going to throw some covenants on there, and I'm going to say that the mailbox always has to be green, and whatever else, some silly stuff like that. In theory, I could do that, and whoever has that property from that point forward would have to follow those rules. Now, the problem is that when I own a house and I own that property, and I am the only one that is governed by those covenants, I'm also the one that enforces those covenants. So it's going to be kind of silly to say, I am going to bind myself to some rules when nobody else around me has any ability to enforce those rules upon me. So that's where I get to some of the fair housing rules. This is what happened in 1949, and then with the Fair Housing Act in the 60s, was that these laws were thrown out. If you look at some older properties in any major city in the United States, you're going to see where they say, here's who is allowed to live here. And it could be by race, by national origin, it could be by religion, some really horrible stuff, but those are purged. Those can no longer be enforced, and they're illegal to enforce. But if you were to go look at the old covenants, you will see them. Now, you are not going to see them online. You're not going to log into, Fulton County, Newton County, somewhere like that, and see these, on the online stuff that you're going to see. But if you were to go back to some of the old paper, you might see some stuff that is shocking. However, one of the books I read a few years ago, a gentleman by the name of Richard Rothstein wrote this, and it was called The Color of Law. And he said, one of the things that a property owner in their own right can do is, if they want to, they can go and say, I'm now the property owner, and I am forever and beyond. Anyone that owns this property is now knowing that I am changing this and saying this is not the case anymore, even though it can't be enforced. It's something where spend a few dollars and go, file new covenants, and you can be known as the person from that point forward that cleaned up that record. They're not enforceable by law, but it was something that was kind of a gesture type thing that he was mentioning in the book. I thought it was kind of a neat thing. But what that demonstrates is that it's something where it is the holders of the covenant who have the power to change the covenant. So let's say in my neighborhood where I when I bought into this, we agreed not to have livestock. But let's say that we decide, a bunch of us in the neighborhood, that wouldn't it be awesome to all have a cow in our backyard, or a goat, or whatever, what, chickens, who knows what. If that became something where enough of the members, and again, we'd have to look to our bylaws, because our covenants are filed as a collective for the neighborhood as a whole. But if we looked at it and said, this is something we really want to change, then we would need to get that whatever the requisite number for our bylaws that would say it. And we would all agree that we all want to have chickens now. Now, we don't have to go out and get a chicken, but it just means that we can no longer complain about our neighbor that has a chicken. And so, or we could complain, but nobody's going to do anything about it. There are no rules on it now. But that could be on anything. I had a situation a few years back where someone was wanting to complain about their HOA because they painted their gutters black, and the covenant said they had to be white gutters. Well, the look and feel of the community, might change, or you may want to change that over time. But if you aren't changing the rules, then they're actually in the right to keep enforcing it. So if I'm in a house and every house looks like a Brady Bunch house, then we've all agreed that's what it should look like. And if we decide that we're going to change the color scheme, then we collectively would need to go do that. Now, oftentimes what happens is, especially in some newer neighborhoods, is they're not going to enforce very specific colors, but they're going to say it has to comply with the Architectural Review Committee. And then they will have some general rules. And that will be something that is determined by maybe a simple majority of the membership. And that's how you can kind of not be stuck in, 1988 forever. It's how you can kind of grow with it. So there's different ways to deal with it. So let's see. Let me get on to the next. The rental rules and corporations buying out subdivisions is a concern. Okay, let me address this. This is something that is something that is going on right now. So how you own a property, whether you are a corporation or an individual, is something that is not something that is going to be typically protected by a covenant. If I were to own my home as an individual. But let's say instead I were to own my home as an estate, or let's say, Fred Smith owns a house. Fred Smith passes away. He doesn't cease to own the property. Well, he does, but the property is now owned by the estate of. And so that's kind of where you get into entities owning property, and why you don't want to go too far down a path to say you have to be an actual individual to own the property, is because then it disrupts the ownership of it, and it could be a dangerous path. Now, rental versus ownership is something that is an easy thing to dislike until you start thinking about it. So the neighborhood that I'm in the mid 2000s saw where there were some people that were losing their homes. It was the 2008, it was the downturn. Some homes went into foreclosure, and banks began to own them. What that means is then people began to buy them. So some investors started buying, and they would lease them out. Or I am potentially going to lose my home, but I get a job in Seattle. I move my family, move back in with in-laws, whatever it may be. I'm able to hold on to that home because I can put a renter in it. Now, at that point in time, there was a movement in our neighborhood to say, let's restrict rentals, because people said, I don't like the person next to me because they're a renter. And let's just assume they weren't taking care of the property, whatever was going on. Everybody typically is in agreement that their neighbor should not be allowed to rent their house, but very few people are ever willing to say, if I hit some hard times or a rough patch, I shouldn't be able to rent my house out. And that's typically what happens, is you have people who, you look at the person next to you, the neighbor that the lawn's not taken care of, who knows what, all kinds of things you hear complaints about, and they want to blame them for being the bad neighbor. But if you really have to cast that vote and say that my neighborhood is not going to allow rentals anymore, you have to be willing to say, if I ever lose my job, if I ever have to move, you're military and you get deployed somewhere else, whatever, if I can't afford to pay that second mortgage that is just extra, I'm not allowed to myself rent it out to someone. And that's what typically kind of holds that back. We tend to look at this as a housing supply issue. Right now, we are in a housing supply crisis in Georgia, and going back for well over a decade, there has not been enough housing starts in Georgia to accommodate the growth rate that we have had. So let's just say buying a house, there are not enough houses being built to accommodate the need that has happened in Georgia with the growth rate that we've experienced. Coupled with that is when I cannot buy a house. So I have some nephews and nieces that are entering the age where they're buying their first houses. It's taking them a long time to find something that they can afford. They stay renters longer. So if you were to go back, say 20 years, you might say, well, people, they get out of school, they rent an apartment for a couple years, they want to get a dog or get married or have kids or whatever, and so they want to go buy a house somewhere. Well, that was kind of the traditional path. I think my parents bought their first house when they were like 22 years old. I think I was probably like 24, 25. Now you're seeing it might be closer to 30 something people are buying a house the first time. And what's happening is that means they're staying renters longer. If you were to look at the rental rate in Georgia, in Metro Atlanta versus the mortgage prices, you're going to see it's astronomically higher. Why is that? Because you have too many people that are needing to rent that may not necessarily want to rent. Now, some people want to rent. And the other thing that's hitting this is you have our two largest groups in our population are our millennials and our boomers. The one thing they both have in common is they don't have a need or a want for a large household. or a large house because they don't have a large household. Let me rephrase that. So the boomers are empty nesters. The millennials are either just starting or haven't started a family yet. What do they want? They want a house that's easy to take care of and close to the fun. So I want something that is, the cool looking house that is built right off the square of the little, town area. I can walk to restaurants. I mean, my in-laws just did this. They sold a beautiful house that they had that, had lots of bedrooms, but also a lot to upkeep. And they bought a little house on Marietta Square that they love, and they can just walk to restaurants. They can walk around. They can do what they want. But that's also where a lot of the people that are on my team want to live too. They want to live in places where they can just walk out the door and go to some fun places. What that leaves is a competition for the same type thing. And some of the houses that are not being built, because that's what is kind of the cool thing to build, are the houses where you can have, a few dogs and several kids and whatever else. So there's some weird kind of needs and mixes that are going on. Some local communities are requiring that certain things be built because they want to force something to be the way they think it should be. I'm going to pick on a county that's a little out to the east from where y'all are at, but there's a county in Georgia that has just set a minimum lot size at 12 acres because they think that's what needs to happen. There are some, and it sounds shocking, it's not uncommon to see a minimum lot size of 1 to 3 acres. And what they'll say is, well, this is what we want to see coming. Well, the problem is if all you are allowing to be built are houses that really nobody wants, then you're going to end up with, let's pick on the most egregious, the 12-acre one. What are you going to end up with? You're going to end up with houses that are very far apart from each other. So it's more upkeep of roads. You're going to end up with a smaller population, so less of a tax digest you're going to be collecting from. And everything from sewer capacity to trash to whatever you're talking about is going to be more and more expensive to take care of. If you were to say, hey, let's instead set some green space aside, but allow people to kind of build in a little denser area, still a cool looking town, something kind of fun, give the feel of a small town, then it's something where you could probably have a lot easier services to provide, but still have, the spaces where it's kind of, you can go out and have some peace and quiet to yourself and walk around and breathe. So, that's where some things that it's not simply rental versus ownership is all one thing or another. It all affects the other. When you don't have enough houses people can buy, then it makes more people renters. When more people are renters, it means they're paying more in rent and staying renters longer because they can't save enough to go buy a house. So it's a kind of a catch-22 on that. The other things that you hit are workforce housing needs. And so if you read any paper, if you listen to any news, it seems like about every other day, Georgia has a new, really cool company that's coming to Georgia. The news is always, this company has decided to relocate its North American headquarters in Georgia. This is what, for what is it like, I think 8 or 9 years now, depends on which publication you're reading, we're the #1 state to do business and everybody wants to move here. During the pandemic, we had even, we had growth where other states didn't. People want to move here. I think it's because I was born and raised here. It's a beautiful state. It's a wonderful place to live. And, the nicest people in the world. But people move here and they want to move here. We aren't keeping up with that demand. And so when you have a new company that is deciding they're going to move to your town, but you're saying, if you want to have a house here, you got to build at least this size and, do it this way, then what you're doing is you're saying, great, we have the headquarters right here in my hometown, but everybody's driving 20 miles to work here. Before I came to the realtors, I was in state government for 23 years. Last place I was at was at economic development. And I was astounded when we would go see these really cool facilities. A new German company that might move into, this town here. And the higher ups, the CEOs, the people that, were kind of the top end of the ladder, all lived within a few miles of the headquarters. But all the people that worked there were driving 20 miles because they couldn't afford to live where the plant was, or where the headquarters were, or where whatever it is. The neighborhood that I'm in, there's a lot of people that are first responders, firefighters, and police that work near where my office is. I mean, I should be one to talk because I live here too, but I drive 20 miles to get to my office, or I drive about 20 something miles to get to the Capitol. Why? Because I have 8 kids. We foster, we adopt, all that stuff. But it's to have a house I can afford to live in, I can't live down there. So it is, it's a real need in Georgia. But I'm gonna get back to the HOA stuff.
Yeah. Hey, so Jeff, there are a couple questions in the chat that's asking about HOAs that the word says runaway HOA board. So basically, kind of got like if they're if there's an HOA and they're not meeting, or they say they don't have a quorum, what recourse do these homeowners have? Yeah.
Sure. So HOAs have to operate just like any other entity by the rules that they have created. So when you look at the, one of the things I would say, if you live in an HOA, look at the covenants and look at the bylaws, because those are going to be your best friends. In any organization, that's going to be your case. Look at the bylaws. A lot of times what we'll see is an HOA will have, when we hear of the bad cases, let me rephrase that. It is because you will have an HOA that is nitpicking everything to death. So let's say I have to have, my mailbox has to be painted black and it has to have the lettering in gold. Well, if they're coming out and they're holding a swatch up to it to see if it's the exact right shade of black and stuff like that, that's where really the homeowners have the ability to, just like with any elected official, say, this isn't how we want to live. We understand that we all agreed to do this, but when 90% of the neighborhood is getting a $25 fine every other week because of something kind of silly, that's where you need to really start attending your HOA meetings, vote for your board of directors, and be certain you're acting, with what you want to have happen. One of the easiest things to do is to be certain that your representation on the HOA board is what you want it to be. They're always going to be elected by the residents. And so anytime I've ever been to an HOA board meeting, I'm always surprised that, in a neighborhood where there's roughly 2,000 houses, you might have about 20 people that show up to the board meetings. And so that's your best course of action.
Jeff, Sylvia McDaniels put this question in here. So Sylvia, if you don't mind, would you give us some idea of
Thank you. I appreciate that, everybody. I don't mean to hijack the meeting.
No, this is a good question. Yeah,
the issue is HOAs are under fire around this state right now. I mean, I've seen horror stories. And we have a horror story. We have a board that's a dictatorship and won't leave. And when we have, they always tell us there's not a quorum, but we don't know that because they won't let us see the votes. Okay, we say, let us see the votes. We can't see the vote. So we can't see the books. They won't let us see the vote. They keep raising our rates. And, homeowners have gotten together all of a sudden, decided we're going to go after the board. Now they're using our money to come after us. So I'm trying to figure out, because again, I'm not from the state of Georgia. I come here and I hear that HOAs are, the big deal here. Particularly for homeowners. I'm talking about homeowners, not condos and townhomes. And it's very difficult to go up against a board because, they come back and they harass you and things like that and start fining you. And I've seen, and the news has done stories on this, and people are just kind of giving up. And we just need to figure out what we can do, what laws we can change so the board doesn't have authority and the residents can have authority again over there.
No. I'm glad you're bringing this forward. So I'll tell you this. My counterparts, the realtors in Texas had situations like yours that were starting to rise up. And they actually, I loved it. They set up a website called myhoahorrorstory.com, and they got everybody to send it in, and they got some laws changed that gave a little more power to get some things changed. But I will say this, you have some tools in Georgia already. So covenants are all going to be filed with your county office. So when you go the same place where your deeds are recorded, the covenants are going to be recorded. The bylaws are going to be something that, when you have a public entity, a corporation that's been established, it is going to be something where those records are going to be filed and recorded with your government offices, because that's how they created. That's how they're created. If I want to see, the corporate filings of any entity in Georgia, I can go to the Secretary of State's office and get that. So what I would do is look to see between your county office and the Secretary of State's office, you should be able to get a lot of what governs them. When they're not operating by their governing documents, then they're subject to a lawsuit and basically being taken to court.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge. That's something where, but it is something where a lot of times what I'll tell people, let me throw this out there. We represent a lot of people that do management of homeowners associations. That doesn't mean that we stick up for the HOAs. In fact, more often than not, we've had battles with them down at the state capitol. And Representative Carter, I don't know if you remember this bill, but we had one a few years back where HOAs started charging exorbitant fees when you moved. And the state law in both sections 109 and 272 said you can't charge more than $10 to tell somebody how much they owe you. And what we were finding was that when you went to move, because nobody else can tell you how much you owe your HOA than your HOA, that they were charging $700, $1,000, all kinds of just, crazy amounts. What we did, and this is another suggestion I'm going to mention to you, is we took it to, first of all, we tried to get the law changed, but the law was on the right side. The law said $10. And so what we were going to do was we were willing to take it up from $10 a little bit, but give a little more enforcement mechanism on it. We got it passed and it got vetoed by a previous governor. But simultaneous to working on that bill, we took it to the Department of Law. And so the Department of Law has an office called the Consumer Protection Division. This is who looks at lemon laws and elder abuse, all kinds of things. When we took it there, they're located in the East Tower of the Floyd Towers, right on the Capitol Hill campus. But when we took it to them saying, here are examples, and we had a few hundred of them just from our members that were bringing it into us, kind of like what the Texas situation did. We said, here are examples of them charging more than $10. And they looked into it and they negotiated settlements with, I'm wanting to say it was 13 different management companies, which amounted to probably several thousand HOAs across the state. So it wasn't the HOAs that were doing it, it was the management companies. And they were charging exorbitant amounts. And they all signed something saying they understood that they could only charge $10. And it was a pretty scary letter that they ended up getting, and they, consented to and agreed to. But so now what we do is when we see that type of an action happening, from time to time, you'll see somebody that wasn't part of that action that is starting to charge, $500, $1,000, some of that for a letter. We tell our members, hey, go grab a copy of it off our website of these, dozens of pages that we have from the, HOA files that we have, and send them a copy of it, show them what they could be facing. And that usually solves the problem. What I would say is if you have what you're seeing is that they essentially are violating state law by not allowing you access to something that you have access to, I would contact the Attorney General, especially if you have a group of homeowners that collectively are facing this. Contact the Attorney General's office and it's the Office of Consumer Affairs. They can at least give you some guidance as to whether they can do something or not. But even if they can't do something, they can point you in the right direction of where you might want to look. We have a situation right now where we had something unrelated to HOAs that was going on, but we saw it as a predatory practice. And we took it to them and the real estate commission at the same time. And they were very clear of what they'd need to see and, you know, how they would work with the real estate commission and kind of what they could do collectively working together. So you do have some decent resources in the state that can help you out on that front. But, you know, if in the end, let's say they say, well, gosh, this looks bad, but unfortunately, Georgia law doesn't address this, then that's where you have Representative Carter on your side, and you can bring it back to her saying, well, hey, the law doesn't address this. Maybe we need to look at it, and we will be right there with you.
Okay, well, I'll take that back to the group because, you know,
Sure,
like
sure.
you said, if it may go beyond that, I can tell you we're suing them. So,
Sure.
and we have to,
The
residents are
Attorney
paying
General's
for it
office
over
has
there.
been a
So
wonderful.
it has gone beyond, you know the bylaws and all that.
Yeah.
We've done all that.
Oh, good.
They're just-
Yeah. I mean, if you have that and they're not following that, I'd start
Yeah,
with them.
they're just,
Because that's going to be a consumer protection issue.
okay,
And the individual that we worked with there, so the investigator that did those particular issues on HOAs, her name was Jackie Neidel.
Mhm.
She's wonderful, very sharp attorney, and she worked on those. But it is, again, it's the Office of Attorney General, and it's their Consumer Protection Division.
Okay,
Great.
I appreciate it.
So, Jeff, there's a question in here that's asking, so a community that doesn't have a HOA, he's asking what percentage of, or she's asking what percentage of the neighborhood has to buy in to actually form a HOA.
So I will answer this. This is where I would say if you're interested in, if you're interested in forming an HOA, I would start early by engaging an attorney that understands property law and can help you with it. Because what you don't want to do is go down a path and make a mistake and have it all fall apart after you've invested a lot of time and resources. My understanding is that when you're forming the HOA, all of the property owners have to agree to it. Because again, it's a consensual agreement that you're going into. So if I have, I kind of think of it this way. If I am walking around with a group of friends and we all are talking about we want to go get some dinner together. And let's say somebody in the group is allergic to seafood. And we all say, you know what, seafood would be really great. Well, that person's not going to go in that restaurant with us. The rest of us will go in and eat. So in other words, if we all agree on what we want to have for dinner, we all got to agree to go into that restaurant together. Otherwise, we're not all in there together. So if I have an older neighborhood that does not have an HOA, all of the owners are going to have to agree to consent to their property because they have full ownership and property rights for the land that they own. And so for them to concede anything over, they have to agree to it. And that's why when we are looking at HOA regulations, we as the realtors looking at private property rights are going to say, well, if you've agreed to it going into it, there's going to have to be something really substantial that changes for the law to supersede it. And for us to say, we want to support a law that does this. Now, I mentioned one that we've actually endorsed for a few years, which has been, and it's not law yet. It's getting closer and closer, but it's one that would say, hey, you should be allowed to have solar panels on your roof, so long as they're not seen, they're low profile, they're this. Well, what's changed about that is the fact that in the past, dozen years, 20 years, whatever, solar panels have gone from something that you could not miss 20 miles away to something that you'd have to get really close to even see that it's not roof tiles. And it's just the technology's changed. And so that's why we as a group that defends private property rights would be willing to say, look, despite what you agreed to, so long as it meets this standard, this is something that should just kind of come in. Same thing, we're always going to be for fair housing laws. And so the code of ethics that realtors abide by is far more stringent than what the law requires in fair housing. And so, a realtor actually could be heavily sanctioned by our organization if they were to be in full compliance with the legal requirements of fair housing, but not in compliance with our own code of ethics with it. And so we're always going to be striving to have that be the standard for fair housing. And so if, let's say, you had an HOA that said, hey, you can't be in a wheelchair here or something like that, that would be something that we would be for, that we would, and there, I don't know of any that do that, but let's say you did have some that said you can't have a ramp, you can't have something, it has to have this look to it. Well, we would be there to say this is something that is not right and should not be the case. And it may or may not be something that fair housing addresses, but that would clearly be something that with our code of ethics that we would be we would be there to say, hey, this is something that we would support a law that would enforce things that are, living to that standard.
So Jeff, there are a couple questions in here.
Sure.
So I think you've addressed, like, if you have an issue with your HOA, and you've addressed if you don't have HOA, but there's a question in here that there's a community that there was a HOA, but it was never, I guess, implemented. And then there's a new developer that's building homes that is now requiring HOA fees.
Okay.
So there's a question in the chat about that.
So let's get into this. The issue of a community that was formed with an HOA, but really just kind of never really said much about it. Those covenants exist still. The covenants didn't go away. One of the problems that you hear about, and this is something where I had a member call me a few years ago and said, hey, there's an HOA and they never invoiced for 10 years any of the dues, but they filed liens so that when you went to move, you owed $10,000. Astronomical fees, and they would let them accrue, but would not ever seek to have that payment made. There are certain elements of current law that address, if you owe your payments, how those are collected, and the penalties that can be assessed for non-payment. And so let's say I owe, just make it simple, let's say I owe $1,000 a year and I don't pay it. They cannot charge me more than 10% interest for filing late. Now, let's say I filed it 10 years later and, they had sent an attorney to try to collect. Well, there are the collection fees, the interest, some of that can start to accrue with it. But in the situations we've seen, it's been that they're not following the late fees. So, they might say, oh, you owed $1,000 and for 3 years you didn't pay it. Well, instead of owing, $3,000 or, $3,000 and, $300, instead they're saying, oh, well, now you owe $12,000. That's something where that can be enforced. I would say 2 places to call. One would be Consumer Protection Division, especially if it's something where it's happening across the board with everyone. If it's something where, there's a legal argument, that's something where I would say consult an attorney, and they can probably help you with that. As far as the HOAs, that let's say it's not about the money side of it, but it's just about they never really did anything and now they want to start doing some stuff. The covenants exist. That is something that has not gone away so long as they are following the bylaws and forming as they should. So member vote, whatever it says in the bylaws, then it's a legal mechanism to dissolve an HOA. So let's say you had something that was formed in 1980. They have not met or done anything since that point in time, and the members of that committee really don't want it to be an HOA anymore. They can band together and essentially do away with it. You would need to look at the bylaws, just like with anything else, of what it would take to change the bylaws, what it would take to change the covenants. And that would be something where you could essentially decommission one. So there's 2 different directions you can go on that. but essentially it's all going to be governed by the rules they put in place to govern it. So let's see what else we have. And I'm sorry, I kind of linger on some of these. What if we are separate homes but considered a condo due to the spaces between the homes? Also, if they aren't enforcing the house rules other than collecting money. I mean, essentially, what's going to determine whether it is a condo association or a POA is how they've organized. And so I could actually have an HOA where there are no yards, and I just have, you know, kind of horizontal houses all next to each other. But we're separate units. Or, you know, I could have a, condo association where it is a, townhouses. They could look a lot alike, but it's just kind of how they formed it and what they filed it under. So when they created the entity, you're going to see they are forming under the POA Act. They're forming under the Condominium Act. Now, a lot of times it is going to be easier to see just by kind of looking at it. I mean, obviously, if it's condominium, it's going to be a Condominium Act. If it is, the 12-acre lot minimums out in Morgan County, well, they're probably not going to call that a condo. But it is something where you're going to be able to look at that. If all they're doing is collecting the money, but they have an obligation to uphold and maintain the amenities, then I think it's a two-way street. You can't not pay because they have the ability to lien, but I think you have the ability to, whether individually or as a collective of residents, take them to court to enforce the action that they're supposed to be doing. So if in the bylaws it says, there will be a pool and the pool will be maintained this way and da 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 da, if they've locked that thing up and haven't taken the tarp off in 10 years and or letting the whole thing fall apart, but they're collecting money for it, it's just like with anything else. If I were to go to a restaurant and they were to charge me $10 for a hamburger and never bring it out, well, that's they're stealing my money. So you can take them to court. And that would be what you would do. You basically be enforcing the bylaws, enforcing, the actions that they have bound themselves to do as part of that mutual agreement. What about the HOA that is not following the law, refusing to show books as a resident member of HOA? I do not have input as to who the CPA firm or the lawyers are. You are. So this is like with anything. Where there is a membership organization. If you're a member of a co-op, if you are a shareholder in a corporation, when you are a member of an HOA, you have that one slice of percentage of what you have there, and you do have the ability to essentially tell them what to do, but it's in a collective voice. So if I'm showing up and I'm one of 1,000 people, they don't do what I say, but if I convince, the majority of those folks, hey, here's what we need to do, and we need to show up the meeting together and do this, then we can do that. If they're not following the law, meaning that the bylaws say, we're having these meetings, these
Here's
are
the latest news.
I
From
said
NPR
something.
News now at 8 p.m. today.
I'm sorry, I just somehow said something that triggered my phone to start giving me the news. But if I look at, again, the things you want to look at are, the bylaws that govern it, the structure that they are, basically establishing themselves to abide by. If they're not following those rules, that is something that could be enforced through the courts. Unfortunately, it is something where you'd have to take that action. But it would be very similar to say, if you and I had an agreement and you said, hey, I'm going to pay you $10 a month and you're going to come and make certain my house doesn't have bugs in it. I'm an exterminator, let's say. If I just kick back and collect your $10 and every time you call me with, roaches and then mice and then rats, and it's just getting worse and worse, and I'm not doing anything, I'm taking your money and I'm not living up to my end of the contract, you can enforce that contract by taking me to court. And so with anything, that's something you can do. I would say though, with these type of entities, because they're not really governmental entities, I kind of call them quasi-governmental entities. They're given certain powers by the statutes that create them in exchange for certain rights that you have that you relinquish to them. So in my typical understanding of private property rights, I have a right to, it's called the bundle of rights, the right to enjoy my property, the right to profit from my property, the right to, lease my property. So I can sell it, I can rent it out, or I can just live in it myself and enjoy it. I agree to restrict myself in exchange for the collective power that I'm giving to an HOA to say, keep all these houses following these rules. If they're not living up to their end of the bargain, then the first thought in a lot of people says, well, then I'm not living up to mine, I'm not going to pay them their money. Well, I've agreed to pay them the money, but if they're not doing their part of it, then I take it to the courts to force the action on them. And that's essentially something that could be done. That is also something, though, that if you see something where they're not showing you the books and it says, hey, every so often we will have this available, we will be sending out the an accounting of where we're at, of that, an annual accounting of, we're gonna have an annual board meeting, something like that. That's something I would go to the Department of Law, again, Consumer Protection Division. They can let you know what they can and cannot enforce with that. But that's at least an area where, because it's not just between, it's not between you and your exterminator or you and your mechanic or something. This is something where it's a collective that's being harmed. So a neighborhood that is not being served the way that their agreement says, that's where I would look at it initially as a consumer protection issue, to say, here's what they're not doing that they've abided by, or they've agreed to abide by.
Yeah, so Jeff, we are winding down.
Sure, sorry about that.
I want to go back to one thing. So in the chat, or somewhere I got a text where, so the community that I was referring to earlier, and I guess we need to fact check this, that the HOA was dissolved. But what I'm hearing you saying, if those covenants were still in place and no one in the HOA didn't, I guess, approve the HOA to the covenants to be removed, then it's still in place. So what has happened, that there were undoubtedly some new lots or some land. So a new developer has come in this community and established a new HOA. So I guess what they're trying to understand, is that possible, or the original covenant stand?
Sure. So if let's say, and this is something that we have seen this from the mid 2000s downturn, is you would have a builder that would come in and they would establish an HOA. There would be covenants, that ran with the land. So it's easy when you're a builder to say, here's what the covenants are going to be, because you're the one that owns all the lots at that point. And so a very common practice is a builder will form an HOA by virtue of covenants that run with the land. So they start off under the latter part of the 200. So this is not the POA Act. This is under the HOA at the kind of the end of the chapter here. And they will say, we're going to form an HOA and here's how we're going to run it. Well, they've established the covenants, and then they have an entity, which really at that point is simply, they don't have as much power as the POA. But what they do is they establish an HOA, and this is kind of how it's a very standard process. I would say somebody that can probably give a lot more insight into this are the home builders, because this is how they typically start it. But the good actors do it this way: is they come in and they say, I'm going to set up this entity. I am essentially kind of the king of the HOA, because I own all the lots right now. So I get to say what I get to do, and I am it. And so they go through and they decide, we're going to build a pool, we're going to have this, here's what we're going to do. Then as they sell off the lots, it's in their interest and in the members' interest typically to say, let's now convert it to a POA. So let's now convert it into the Property Owners Association Act. But what they end up doing is you'll typically see, it will say, whomever has 51% of the interest, is controlling the HOA until they no longer have 51%. And that means that the builder has ultimately the say of what's happening until they sell most of the lots. And that keeps them with the ability to say, I'm going to build a pool, I'm going to build a playground, I'm going to do this. That way they're not every other week, the rules are changing on them. And then as they build it out, it migrates into an HOA that is governed by the property owners that are there. Because as soon as they lose that 51%, then it's the people that are voting. But when they never sold that 51%, because the neighborhood collapsed in 2009, they went bankrupt. Now you have a lot of covenants without an entity to govern it. What you end up with is whoever owns those lots now can say, I'm enforcing these covenants. If you bought a lot in that neighborhood, you may realistically be facing that I've agreed to abide by the rules of the covenants that I bought into, but now there's a new entity that owns kind of the majority of all the lots that collectively were filed together. So you could be in a situation where it's not as clear cut as what was intended, and it's not as clear cut as, it's an HOA where the board's elected this, where it's clearly understood. I would say if you're in a situation like that, and it's usually not so much just the dollar amount they're charging, because honestly, the HOA can charge whatever the assessments are. So let's say in my neighborhood, I'm paying $1,000 a year to be a member of my HOA, but let's say something horrible happens and all the trees around the clubhouse fall on it all at once, and there was nothing that said they had to have insurance on it, just some crazy things that happened. Well, then we need to rebuild it, and now we're going to pay $2,000 next year because we all are being assessed. Typically it doesn't happen with neighborhoods. It happens a lot though, or periodically with condos, so that everything's fine and wonderful until we need a new roof. And since we're all under the same roof together, we got to pay for it together. A great example of this, or a horrible example, but just a good, something to focus on, is when you looked at the collapse of the condominium down in Florida, where there was zero upkeep for years. They never wanted to raise the assessments or the dues because it was just kind of, keeping it even keel. We don't want to rock the boat too much. But year after year, it was deteriorating to the point where it fell apart. That is why in Georgia, you have a lot more regulation on this than you do in other states, is because it's wanting to be certain that it's solvent and sound, that somebody's not simply just raking in the money and skipping town and not taking care of things. So it is something where that's also why when you buy a house or buy a condo, you're going to have a lot of lender requirements that they want to see the books, and they want to see that the maintenance records are being taken care of, so that things like that don't happen. So there are protective measures in place. It's just they're not always in every state and enforced the same way. So it's very similar to that. But back to the HOA, where let's say you have this new builder that's come in, they're restarting the HOA. I would say, unfortunately, it's one where when you bought into it, you bought into the covenants you bought into, and those covenants are going to cite how it's handled. If it's not as clear cut, you may end up being under an HOA that you never thought you were under because it wasn't being enforced for 10 years. But, if it starts up, you're bound to those by the covenants that you bought into 10 years ago. But it is something, again, if you feel like it's abusive, if you feel like it's egregious behavior, it is something where for a relatively small amount, you could probably have an attorney look at it and see if you're being taken advantage of with it. It's a lot, while that may be a little bit of a cost, it's a lot less than living with it for 10 years down the road. The other is if collectively you feel it's something where there's a large group of people in the community that are being harmed by this. It's something where you could take it to the Consumer Protection Division, because they can look at it as, is this something where they're following, are there laws that could be protecting you on this or not? And they're going to be able to work with you as a consumer in that sense, to at least give you a little bit of guidance on that front.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think I learned a lot. I hope you all learned a lot, and this was a lot.
Well, I'm always happy to help in any way I can.
Absolutely.
Representative Carter, any of you out there, really feel free. I'm on the Georgia Association of Realtors website. We have a good team of people that can, if you feel like there's something where the laws aren't right, or there's something going on, reach out to us. We can, take it to our members, and they feel it's something we can be working on. We can help with that. But the biggest thing, honestly, is when it comes to consumer issues, you have a wonderful consumer affairs protection division. And for years, that they've been wonderful at helping consumers on day-to-day things that happen in the interest of protecting Georgians. And you have a wonderful representative also that is someone that can help connect you to some of those resources, and the same with your local government there, the commissioners and city council folks. So always happy to
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I really, really appreciate it. I put my contact information in the chat. Commissioner Sanders put her contact information in the chat, and Councilwoman Alsabrook, if you're able to put your information in the chat. So this was a great talk. One of the main things, my takeaway for you all is you have to know what's in your covenants. So if you have a HOA that you can't get the documents, Jeff has told you where you can find them. So either at the Secretary of State or at the county office, because those covenants had to have been filed. And it sounds like you may need to do some campaigning out in your subdivision to get people engaged, and then come together and do the work. Because some of this may be happening because you don't have the information that you need in those covenants, because that's what you're going to abide by. So Commissioner Sanders, I don't know if you had any closing words, and Councilwoman, I almost call her Congresswoman also, but Councilwoman, if you wanted to.
I just want to say this topic was right on time. I get a lot of questions about HOAs, especially in my area. So we have, in my district alone, we're the largest in Newton County, and we have a lot of homes being built, probably about 3,000 houses being built currently.
Wow.
So this has been the topic of a lot of individuals wanting to know their rights, the abuse of HOAs, the boards. So they wanted to know what their rights were and how they can proceed with it. So you actually answered a lot of questions. So thank you so much, very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman, are you able to unmute? Do you want to say some final words? Okay, she may not.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was trying to get out of the bed, but no, I don't have anything to say other than this was great. I mean, it was so much information. I was trying to keep up, but I really appreciate Mr. Sanders for you taking time out to do this. I know it was a lot of information that people may not have understood, but this gives them a base. So thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it and happy to help however we can.
Right, and because it was a lot of information, I think I know I posted this on my all my pages, I think, in social media. Commissioner has it on hers. So if you find Friends for Doreen Carter, State Rep Doreen Carter, you'll be able to go onto my Facebook page or Commissioner Sanders' Facebook page, and you can go back and listen to this information again, because it was a lot. And maybe we'll do it again, after sign and die. And for those of you who maybe aren't following us in the legislature, it's not too late. We have, I think, 6 days left. The session ends April 4th, but you can always tune in to the sessions at the Georgia General Assembly on our website, on the Georgia General Assembly website. On the page, there's always a live link. We're usually in session at 10 and sometimes by midday, but the closer we get to sign and die, there'll be longer evenings, and then there's all kind of committees. So there's plenty of information. And I know the commissioners and the city council, their meetings are live as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Councilwoman Alsabrook, because if it had not been for her urging me on, and then me course and Commissioner Sanders to come join us, And then Jeff, we can't say thank you enough for this information. I hope you all have at least some nuggets that you could take with you, and have a great evening. And thank you again. I'm State Representative Doreen Carter. I am a champion for the people. And so I always want to be able to serve in any way we can. So good night. Thank you guys for joining us.
Night.